Hello, good evening, and a warm welcome to this evening's BIC Streams session Underwater Architects, understanding the life of corals and how our lives depend on them. Tonight, we have with us naturalist, marine biologist, and master diver Chetna Purushottam, who will take us through some crucial information about the world underwater and how it affects those above water. A few bits of instruction. The full bio of Chetna will appear on the chat box. And if you have any questions through Chetna's talk, please use the Q&A box to pose your questions and she will answer them at the end of the session. Don't forget to subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on our various social media channels. With that, I hand it over to Chetna.
So good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking BIC for inviting me to talk to you all today. I always look forward to talking about corals and the underwater world. So I spent the past 7 or 8 years in the Andaman Islands, and my job was to take people out diving and uh, try and introduce and excite as many people as I can about the underwater world. And I do have a special spot for corals. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you now are things that you can actually see the next time you get a chance to go diving or snorkeling, or even say take a walk along the beach if there are rocky tide pools around you. And so these are things that I also learned through observation over the years. And so I like to refer to these animals as underwater architects because of what they end up creating through the course of their lives, just as a means of survival. For those of you who have experienced coral reefs, seen them in documentaries or through pictures, a lot of this actually would be something that you may have noticed. Um, but we know coral reefs to be extremely colorful ecosystems, extremely diverse. And also, they're known to be some of the most concentrated among spaces with the most amount of diversity, like packed, in every square meter. So you have animals that are growing in 3 dimensions, sort of stacking one above the other. They come in different shapes, sizes, and these are ecosystems that are so large that in places like the Great Barrier Reef, you can actually see them from space. And who are the creators? Who are the ones that actually build these structures? It's actually living, breathing animals that we call corals. And they are essentially individual animals that we call coral polyps. Okay, each of them are actually really small. And in this picture, which is a zoomed in section of one coral, you can see these small, petal-like, tentacle-like things, which are basically the tentacles of a single polyp that is sitting inside a cup that is made of coral, that is made by the animal itself. And so predominantly corals around the world live in colonies. So these are all individuals that are sort of clones of each other, because in a single coral, over time, they actually bud to grow and increase their sizes. And usually they live in these really beautiful colonies that they make themselves. So they're all connected to each other, they share information. But what you see as a colony of coral is what emerges from each of these individuals feeding, eventually growing and building a calcium skeleton around them for protection. And these tentacles that you see actually have stinging cells. So these animals are related to anemones, they're related to jellies, and they are using these tentacles to trap small microscopic animals in the water that we call plankton. So they usually do this at night. And if we were to just sort of look at a textbook, illustration for a second, I will use this laser pointer just to guide you. So over here is what you could imagine a coral polyp looks like. You can see these tentacles sticking out, and they have the stinging cells, which help them trap plankton to feed on, which then goes inside their mouth. And here you can see that really beautiful texture of a single coral polyp. Now, if you were to just take a slice of it and see what it looks like inside, it's this large cavity in which it sends its food in. And but what's interesting about these corals is that, and also as you can see below this whitish bit over here, is the skeleton that it builds and keeps accumulating through the course of its life. And while it's alive, most corals actually live in partnership with a really tiny so a single cell plant like organism called zooxanthellae. Okay, these are really small and there are millions of them within every polyp. And what purpose do they serve? So this is what you could imagine they look like if you were to look under a microscope. And they're basically living in a symbiotic partnership. So on one hand, these are photosynthetic in nature, the zooxanthellae. So they're able to use sun's energy to produce food. And in the coral, they are providing about 90% of all the energy needs of the coral. And in exchange, the corals give them a space to stay, so they're getting shelter. And even though corals have tentacles and they use that to sting plankton, that actually contributes to very little of the nutrition that they get, because a lot of it actually comes from zooxanthellae. And so with zooxanthellae, these corals are able to grow grow really large, grow very fast. But that is also why these corals predominantly are found in shallow areas, so that they're able to give these zooxanthellae access to sunlight. And once this partnership has been formed, we see that these corals are able to grow in various different shapes, different textures. You might imagine that corals will typically have a sort of honeycomb kind of texture, which you do see with a lot of them, but not always. So sometimes they have these really strange, beautiful looking sort of wavy structures. There are some corals that you will usually have to, go, with your head sort of upside down to look, inside the darker crevices to find corals like the one over here. Some of them look like branches of a tree, which we actually call branching coral. And some of them have sort of swollen, bulby polyps, which almost always remain swollen, which was also the video that I showed you a little earlier. And the diversity is really striking, because not all corals build calcium skeletons. So not all are hard coral. You also have soft coral. So these don't have calcium based or limestone based skeletons. They do have different other forms, but they are a lot more flexible. So when you do look at them in the water for a moment, you think they are plants, because they sort of sway in the water. And there are loads of different soft corals as well. And not all corals will live in colonies. There are some corals that actually live alone, like this one here. In fact, this particular kind of coral not only is solitary, but it is also not attached. You would imagine that corals are always attached to a certain substrate, which is also usually the case, but this one actually sort of can get tossed around if there is, a surge or a bit of current in the area. And these corals, through time, so whether you have a couple of polyps that ultimately grow into a smaller colony, into a larger colony, that is happening simultaneously with different species, eventually is how you get this reef. And so essentially a coral reef has its foundations made by this animal, which we call coral, which come in various different species, shapes, sizes, and textures. And they are home to a mind-boggling diversity of animals, not just the larger animals, not just the fish, but also invertebrates. So like on land, even underwater, a majority of the animal diversity are invertebrates, those animals that don't have a backbone like us, starting from tinier fish to really bizarre looking animals like you see in this picture. This is a kind of crustacean. It's called a squat lobster. Um, not just animals that you would see, perching or living or sitting on corals, but even the smaller crevices and cracks in these coral reef structures are home to a lot of burrowing animals, which, spend most of their time inside, or animals that depend on these structures for shelter. So there are many different types of animals that directly feed on coral, that eat the coral polyps, but there are many that then come to predate on animals that depend on coral for food. So that really 3D network of complex structures also provides shelter for various different animals. And at any given point, a section of the reef is going to look extremely colorful, and pretty much everything that you see in this picture is either some kind of animal or a plant, or some kind of algae that's growing on what was initially laid down by coral. And corals are found around the world. So the hard corals, the ones that make these large reefs, typically are found in shallower areas. They're found in warmer areas. So if you look at this map of the world, all the pink spots are coral reefs. And you will see that they're largely found in the tropics, and they're largely also found closer to the coast, or in very shallow areas. But these are not the only kinds of corals that we find. There are corals that you will also find deeper down in the water, like this one here is commonly called the bubblegum coral. And there are actually thousands of species of corals that are found in colder and deeper waters. And so, in fact, a lot of it is actually found in the Atlantic, and closer to places like Europe, UK, and in the Caribbean, in the Americas. And so these are places that we are only recently starting to explore, since we can access these areas through submarines and remotely operated vehicles. So corals are distributed throughout the world. And once you have corals that have established in an area, whether they are in shallow water or they're in deep water, they essentially now provide a place for slowly an ecosystem to start to assemble. You have the smaller invertebrates, then you have the fish, and eventually you have this really complex um, web of life that you can find. And just some of the examples of the animals we find, I'm obviously not going to be able to represent every kind of animal that you find, but some of these are really bizarre. So if you look at the invertebrates, those animals that don't have a backbone, but they do ultimately, invariably have some or the other type of, skeleton that helps them, protect them from predators, but also give them some sort of structure in a medium like the ocean that is constantly in motion. And these animals feed on everything from small plankton to other kinds of invertebrates. A lot of them play the role of being the decomposers or the detrivores, feeding on the dead and decaying animals. And there are many invertebrates that also eat fish. So everything from tube worms on the left, you might be looking at them and wondering how these are worms. They have these really feathery appendages, which is what they use to trap plankton. And the rest of the worm is inside this little tube that it makes using sediment bit of shell. Then you've got sponges, which also come in various different shapes and sizes. And they basically filter water in and out and trap plankton in that way. And mollusks, everything from slugs and snails to octopus, squid, cuttlefish, cousins of corals, so anemones, and animals that we call hydroids, and animals that are really fun to observe when you go into in these environments, like crustaceans, whether it's these large crabs that are sort of scraping algae off of rocks, or small shrimps that are constantly cleaning other animals, that want to get bits of dead skin or parasites off of their body. And sea stars or starfish that we love to see are just one of many other animals that you have in that same group, from sea urchins, sea cucumbers, to this brittle star that you see in this picture. And these are really the most abundant kind of animals that you see underwater. But there are also the larger animals. The diversity of fish is really, really something. So initially, you would have, probably thought of fish as being that really standard image that we draw in school, only to realize that most fish don't really look like that. They come in really bizarre shapes. Starting from the wobbegong, which is the type of shark. And you're like, when would you have ever imagined a shark needing camouflage on a reef, to really colorful reef fish like the triggerfish, or ambush predators like this stonefish here, which has to look as close to coral as it possibly can to be able to fool other fish which it wants to eat, to beautiful fish like Moorish idols, or larger predators like the trevally, just to name a few, but also having marine reptiles from sea kraits to turtles that frequent these environments. And so coral reefs really are a very diverse and busy ecosystem with all of these different animals, depending on each other, like amazing examples of cooperation, places where you can get to see some really phenomenal sights like schooling fish. So at any given point, it is a really sort of thriving environment that we often don't think about or get to see, because you do have to put your head inside the water to be able to see this. But once you do, all you need is probably just a mask, even if you don't want to go fully underwater, to get a glimpse of what a day on a reef must be like. And this entire ecosystem, which starts off with coral sort of laying the foundation, actually starts in the blue. Okay, so a lot of animals in the water, starting from fish to other kinds of invertebrates, including corals, a lot of the time start through the process of spawning. So where corals release eggs and sperms simultaneously, because for a lot of them, the fertilization happens out in the water. So you have millions of eggs and sperms being released into the water across large areas at the same time, so that they can successfully sort of fertilize in the water. And as you can imagine, when these are really small, they are in the plankton, and there is a high chance of predation. So very few of these actually successfully become baby corals. And eventually, until they are big enough to find a spot on a new reef to settle down and become, a sessile or stationary coral, they will drift in the current. Something like what they might look over here. And during the process of spawning, these happen at such scales that you could actually see it with, say using a drone. Or this is what a bird's eye view of spawning looks like. So starting with this, eventually landing on a substrate or a part of the reef that might be suitable for coral growth, which would mean, an area that is not too sandy, because, one day you're exposed to sunlight and the next day, whole amount, like lots of grains of sand just sort of smother you. That wouldn't make sense. So once a spot has been found where, the coral is likely to survive, and eventually from that point start to bud and eventually start to slowly grow that coral. And this is not a very fast process. So anything that is growing and, producing a calcium skeleton takes a very, very long time. So on average, corals grow at about 1 or 2 centimeters a year. There are some corals like the branching forms that can grow much faster, about 10 centimeters a year or so, which is still quite slow. So if you ever see a coral colony that looks pretty big, it's possible that it's much older than us. And extremely large domes that you see could even be 50 to 100 years old. So they can potentially keep growing, but something like this little baby coral here is probably already maybe a couple of months old. But given the right, optimum conditions, which means that there should be sufficient light coming in so that the zooxanthellae, or those really tiny single cell algae that are living in the coral. So there's enough light for them so that they're able to photosynthesize and then give coral the food. And optimum temperature. So there is a certain range within which of temperatures within which corals can survive and thrive. Going either way can result in stress to these animals. And so given the optimum conditions, these corals can actually continue to grow and eventually start to have a thriving ecosystem with all of those other reef animals that I was talking about. And coral reefs, like other natural ecosystems, are extremely important to us as humans, as well as to general functioning of natural processes on Earth. As of now, we do estimates show that at least 25% of marine diversity, including fish, but not restricted to in the ocean, can be found on coral reefs across the world. And because these are extremely complex three-dimensional structures that can be as shallow as touching the surface of the water, or even being exposed when the tide sort of retreats. They can be that shallow, going to fairly deep in the water. They act as sort of protective barriers because a lot of them are found around the coastline. So they really sort of absorb the shocks when not just with tsunamis, but even just with storms and cyclones and winds. Coral reefs really act as a natural barrier. And in terms of food, for a huge population across the world today, seafood is the most affordable kind of protein and that is available, and a huge population of of people around the world depend on coral reefs for food alone, and it powers whole economies of countries. And for example, even in the Andaman Island, in India, the Andaman Islands depend heavily on tourism, which is that has grown purely based on exploring coral reefs through diving and snorkeling, which has ultimately allowed this huge tourism-based economy to grow, which ultimately has provided employment to the people who live in the Andamans, as an example. So, and yeah, then, everyone lived happily ever after. So that sounds like a good story, wouldn't it? But unfortunately, in a lot of places around the world where you would expect corals to be growing in these really amazing formations, amazing colors, filled with marine life at every corner that you turn on a reef. It doesn't actually look like that. And you don't have to go all the way to the Great Barrier Reef to see some of this damage. It is definitely one of the areas that have been researched and talked about a lot, but it is definitely a very important issue that we have right here in India, where you would expect a reef to look really healthy like this. What you end up actually seeing is not just a space bereft of color, it's because there is actually a huge loss of life, where what you see is definitely there is a lot of structure. These are calcium sort of skeletal remains of what once would have been live coral. So you can see what looks like something that may have been a branching coral, and a couple of large slabs of table coral, which was, this is not a before after image, but for you to imagine what it must have looked like in these two different stages. So what was the reason for this? And this is a phenomenon that has been recorded over and over again across the world. And we call this coral bleaching. The term coral bleaching signifying that corals which were once extremely colorful now have sort of lost all that color, and what you see is white. And what's happening here is that the corals have sort of let go or expelled of the small zooxanthellae, which otherwise there would have been millions of them in each polyp, have sort of been expelled. What does that mean? Corals that are white are still alive, Okay, so they've still got the polyps, they've got the tentacles, they could potentially continue to feed on the plankton, but because majority of the food that they need comes from the zooxanthellae, they are essentially starving at this point. And if they do not get their zooxanthellae back, they have about a period of 2 weeks where they can manage without zooxanthellae and just with their own feeding. Beyond that, they basically start to succumb to disease, and they eventually get outcompeted by other faster growing organisms around them, which usually is other larger kinds of algae that we call macroalgae. And why does coral bleaching happen? So this is a phenomenon that was first reported and realized this was a very serious issue in the late 80s and in the 90s. And what was essentially happening is that because of an increase in the temperature of the atmosphere, it was causing an increase in the temperature of the water. So enough greenhouse gases and CO2 being pumped into the atmosphere was causing the water. So it is not just in one location or one region. So this is across the Indo-Pacific, for instance. Even a single degree rise in temperature uniformly across these areas, making the water warmer and ultimately causing these coral animals to stress. So different animals in the ocean have been affected differently with increase in water temperatures and increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that the oceans are absorbing. So the oceans in general do absorb at least a quarter of the carbon dioxide that is pumped into the atmosphere. And so that quantum has also increased over the last few decades as greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have increased. And so with corals specifically, as the temperature increases, it sends the coral and the zooxanthellae, that symbiotic relationship it sort of destabilizes, it sort of just breaks apart that relationship, which sends the coral into stress and ultimately making it lose or get rid of its zooxanthellae. So this is a phenomenon, the coral bleaching phenomenon is still fairly new, and there are still scientists that are trying to figure out what exactly is happening to these corals that they let go of their zooxanthellae when really it's providing 90% of its nutrition. So there are a bunch of different explanations for what might be happening what might be actually happening simultaneously that ultimately make these corals let go of their zooxanthellae, get bleached. And ultimately, what happens with these mass coral bleaching events is that the cause of their stress, which is the increase in temperature, barely by a degree, does not subside in time. So it goes on for more than 2 weeks. Sometimes it's a couple of months, which ultimately weakens the corals, they die, and they become just another surface for other organisms to grow on. For example, here you have this large macroalgae that has taken over this colony. And over time, there are some types of coral that might still retain those structures, but many corals eventually would crumble and you will have something like a graveyard instead. And where is all of this carbon dioxide or warming coming from? So it's really a lot of the activities that are happening throughout the world. It's anybody's guess. So you've got everything from burning fossil fuels to clearing large amounts of forests, even producing cement. There are some estimates that say that that contributes to 8% of the global greenhouse. So, fueling our transport, our electricity, all of the factories, the manufacturing units that depend on fossil fuels are all, since the Industrial Revolution really made a significant dent in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which ultimately is affecting the ocean in terms of making it warm and also making it more acidic because of the amount of carbon dioxide that has increased in the water. And so on one hand, okay, there has been coral bleaching, which has been reported from all of the ocean basins. And so, okay, they died. Why can't they just recover, right? it is possible for, whatever the remaining adult colonies to spawn, to reproduce, for them to settle down again. If there's, plankton for them to feed on, if there's enough light and steady temperatures, they still can make a recovery. But unfortunately, that is not the case, because coral bleaching, even though at any given point it is a one-off event, it sort of hits like an episode and then sort of goes away. These episodes have been happening time and again, and with increasing frequency and intensity. So there are very few spots across the globe where bleaching has not taken place, or bleaching has not taken place with extreme intensity. And so this is a map actually just documenting the events of bleaching up until, I think, about 2015. And since then, there's also been like severe cases of bleaching in the year 2016 and 17. And we expect that bleaching with this frequency will continue if we are continuing the same trajectory where our greenhouse gases and climate change are concerned. And there are actually studies that project that even right in the 2030s, we're going to see the number of years. So initially it was once in about 4 to 5 years where bleaching was taking place, but now we're going to see bleaching taking place more frequently with every year. And some places where we think that there may not actually be any coral left. So as of today, I think we've lost about 20% of coral reefs in the globe. And we stand to steadily lose what's remaining. And why is that? Oops. So on one hand, we might be able to support some amount of diversity of animals in these environments, even if the corals are dead. But eventually these ecosystems are going to collapse because with every bleaching event, we are losing more and more adult corals. As we know, these corals not only reproduce sexually, they can also bud and grow asexually. So if a bit of a coral has been sort of broken off, if it lands in a place where it can continue to survive, that could result in a coral colony growing again. But with every bleaching event, we are losing more and more remnant surviving coral. And it's not just bleaching or temperatures increasing that is the only threat. That acts in synergy with so many of these other threats that are taking place simultaneously in the water. So everything from pollution, which comes with increasing effluents, with all these chemicals, sort of changing the chemical environment in the water, with adding more nutrients. We've also got plastic, which is a huge issue, because we know they break down into microplastics, and there are so many more chemicals that leach into the water, not to mention how they affect all of these other animals that live on the reefs. And every animal or every species that you find in the reefs, inadvertently through its life, ends up allowing other forms of life, to sustain. For example, you have so many different species of fish that act as herbivores that constantly mow down algae on reefs, making room for new coral to grow if there are successful reproduction events. But as we sort of scoop out millions of tons of fish, we are losing these important components of this ecosystem as well, which otherwise would have been quite resilient and being able to recover from past bleaching events. And something like fishing, which happens, those fishing practices that are really large scale, that don't really target any one kind of animal, but really going to get as many fish as you can, resulting in a lot of bycatch. But on the other hand, also this resulting in a lot of discarded nets, which we call as ghost nets, because even though they are not attached to a boat, they're not actively being used by humans to fish, they inadvertently continue to fish in the water, trapping animals, and eventually leading to quite a significant decline in populations of animals. and not to mention damaging this three-dimensional structure that are built by corals. And so what's the worst that can happen? So as I had mentioned initially, we depend on coral reefs in a number of ways. There are these services that they end up providing for us in the way of the protecting our coastlines and providing this amazing marine biodiversity. But today, at least 500 million people rely on coral reefs, not just for food, but in terms of being able to power whole economies, providing livelihoods, again, not just to people who are in the fishing industry, but everything from tourism to science to medicine. And also people who rely on the sea for for their way of life, from nomadic communities of people who live in the sea to the large population that continues to live along the coastline, and that number is projected to increase. So with every year, with every sort of decline in the population of corals and coral reefs, we are also having, we can expect an increasing dependence on coral reefs in all of these different ways. So it's a sort of situation we will have to brace ourselves for if we are not able to see corals and therefore coral reefs start to recover. And you might say, okay, coral reefs are just one ecosystem. In fact, coral reefs occupy a very small fraction of the ocean floor, and they are not the only ecosystem. You have many other ecosystems. You've got mangroves, you've got the rocky shore, you've got seagrass meadows, and in the colder water you have kelp, and you definitely have the deep sea ecosystems as well. But these are all interconnected, and losing coral reefs is a sign that it is ultimately going to have a domino effect on each of these different ecosystems. So on one hand, when you look at the ocean, it looks like this vast, never-ending place that, how could we potentially ever empty the ocean of fish, or how could we, significantly impact this entire ecosystem? But the truth of the matter is that we are at a point when we have. And these impacts that we see on coral reefs do mirror what's happening in a lot of these other ecosystems underwater as well. And with the way that we see climate change sort of progressing and looking at the increase in the atmospheric temperature and underwater, as of today, at least 50% of reefs across the world have experienced severe bleaching. And by 2050, just with about maybe 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in rise in the water temperature, we expect there actually may not be a single reef that has not been hit by severe bleaching. And there will be a large number of dead zones in these places where there's actually nothing that's going to be able to repopulate these ecosystems again. And on the other hand, with something like plastic, which already is pretty much found in every part of the ocean, including right down in the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest part of the ocean, by way of weight, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. So that's weight, not, and plastic is really some of the lightest material you can find. So you can imagine just how populated with plastic the ocean is going to be. But while these might seem like really overwhelming issues that, how could we potentially even begin to tackle, what we really require to happen is that the temperatures for corals to recover need to sort of be established again. We just need to make it within their optimum range, which is, say, not to exceed more than, say, 33 to 34 degrees in the summers, which would require us to prevent the ocean from warming up like this, which will come from being able to reduce the carbon emissions, reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we have right now being pumped into the atmosphere. And also to be able to reduce some of these other slower, chronic stressors like, overexploitation of marine life, not just fish, but all of the other animals that we lose through these destructive fishing practices. as well as really making a concerted effort in reducing, the marine trash or the debris, which largely is plastic today. And these are obviously things that we need really large scale action at the policy level, at the level of governments, not just of individual countries, but oceans are shared by all these land masses. So we have to start working together. But and these are something that are going to take time, but ultimately to reduce the impacts of something like climate change, to slow it down, these are the scales in which change needs to be taken. But at the same time, not to underestimate the impact that as individuals we can have in the way we modify, or moderate our daily lifestyles, and therefore reducing our carbon footprint and a sort of consumptive behavior. Whether it's seafood and the kinds of seafood we eat, and the kind of impact or stress it has on the oceans, or the way we use objects, material that you're not really sure where it's going to end up in, will probably ultimately end up in the ocean, if not any other natural system. So seeing if there are tweaks in the way we live each day, as a way to sort of, as individuals, make a sort of effort, because ultimately what can emerge is from individual actions, into a sort of larger community scale impact. And because on one hand, yes, we could do, symptomatic kind of, relief to alleviate some of these issues, coral restoration by transplantation and providing structures for corals to grow definitely does work. But these are very high intensive, they require a lot of effort, and in many places will also be very expensive. And these usually will be in extremely small areas, and these will not stop climate change. These will not stop the oceans from warming, and these will still get bleached if another sort of coral bleaching event happens. And so all of the effort that you put in here is actually not going to come to anything. So you do need some of these larger steps to be taken. And in the meantime, these sort of actionable projects actually can make a difference, but we cannot rely on these alone. So for example, we can ask ourselves, can we afford to lose more coral today, whether it's in the form of large projects, developmental projects, as we see is being talked about a lot in Australia, in the huge coal hub, the coal production terminal, and all of that coastline development and dredging of the reef that we expect might happen if that project comes through in Queensland, or if we really want to have a coastal road, for example, in Mumbai, which is going to basically go over whatever little coral that's actually surviving and thriving in waters like Mumbai at this point in time. Is that a kind of risk that we want to take? And so on one hand, yes, our survival does depend on corals. And coral reefs as one of the many ecosystems in the water, because of the role that they play, the ecosystem services that they provide to all of us, which we may not realize in our daily lives. But then another reason why we would like to have them around is because they're extremely beautiful environments. They are absolutely incredible, results of evolution that continue to take place. So I would want to be able to continue diving, continue to see these animals, even when I'm 50 and 60 years old. And I want to be able to take other people to these places, because that is a sort of connection with nature I don't want to lose. And a lot of the times when people want to know what they can do, towards helping with conservation, or in what way they can contribute to protecting some of these places, you don't actually have to be a biologist or a conservationist at all points. Because a lot of it actually comes from just getting to know these environments. So I would say to begin with, it would be to not lose your connection with nature. So whether we're talking about parks or forests, or it's actually access to the oceans, that's really where the relationship starts. So it starts off with curiosity, wanting to know what these animals are, and actually seeing some really incredible behaviors for yourself, and starting to now acknowledge their presence and accommodating for them in our daily lives, and not wanting to sort of lead a path of development which comes at the cost of these animals that we, and ecosystems that we share our lives with. And so through my work with Spiders in the Sea, which is a sort of science and nature education enterprise that I've started, that's what I want to do. I want to get as many people as possible sort of as ocean ambassadors to be able to continue this dialogue and to bring an awareness to as many people as we can, because the first step in all of this is actually really education. And for a lot of people, we might never have gotten a chance to go into the ocean, or we might actually fear the ocean. So it is understandable if you don't immediately sort of know or, appreciate what goes on there. And so I would say that the best way to start would actually just stepping out whenever we get the chance. And with that, I would like to end my talk. I guess now.
Yeah, we have a few questions. If you open your Q&A box, maybe you can pick out the ones that you would like to answer.
Okay, so let's.
Some of them you've already addressed in your talk.
Okay, so Kumar asks, what education is needed to become a marine biologist? So on one hand, 1 second. Oh, I lost that one. Okay, so on one hand, you do have, if you want to become a marine biologist and go into academia or science and conservation, there are numerous marine biology courses around the world. In India, I'm actually not sure of what a good marine biology course would be. The closest that you could start off with would be courses in wildlife biology and conservation, which is the one that I actually did at NCBS, which is in Bangalore. And then all of the learning that I had was really on my own. So self-learning in today's time is actually possible. But otherwise, I think there is a lot that you can learn just by spending more time in the ocean. So how do tube worms protect themselves? So you can imagine tube worms to almost look like earthworms. And so a majority of their body actually is within a tube of their own making, which could be made of a bit of calcium, bit of sediment, and they use with their mucus. And so they actually drill into corals and or into sandy areas. And they have those feathery structures which they use to trap plankton. And they actually have pretty good reflexes. So if there's any sort of threat that they anticipate, they have these eye spots, so they can't really see, but they can see, changes in light. So if they sort of see a shadow go over, they are able to quickly send those feathery parts inside to protect themselves until they feel the coast is clear, and then they slowly, you'll see them emerge again. It actually looks quite cool, like a flower in bloom. How do corals reproduce? So they reproduce pretty much, most of the corals reproduce externally. So corals can colonies can be all male, all female, or sometimes they can be both. And sometimes the reproduction happens inside, and through their polyps, they will send out their fertilized egg. Or other times, like in that picture I showed you, where you see that sort of sludge on the surface of the water, that's millions of sperms and eggs that these corals have released, and they fertilize in the water. And then you have a small baby coral that you will call a planula, the larva, that will swim through the water until they're old enough to settle down on a reef. So yeah, you do have male and female corals. So how are deep water corals different from shallow water corals, and how does the reduced presence of sunlight affect the relationship between zooxanthellae and coral? So that's a really good question. So that is actually one of the fundamental differences between corals that you find in shallow areas and ones that you find deep. So an important thing to remember is that there are many corals that depend on zooxanthellae as a major source of nutrition, but it is not necessary. There are many kinds of corals that don't have zooxanthellae or don't use them that much and do their own feeding on plankton. So in areas where there is no light, like in deeper down, you will have corals that will primarily use their tentacles and feed on plankton. Um, how delicate is the situation of corals in India? Yes, there is severe bleaching. So in India, if you Google where the major coral reefs are, you will see the Andaman Islands, which has a really vast expanse of coral reefs. So the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, you have the Lakshadweep, you have Gulf of Mannar, Gulf of Kutch, but actually you have coral reefs, if not really large and extensive, almost throughout the mainland coast. You can dive in Chennai, you can see coral reefs in Pondicherry, as you can see corals growing off the coast of Mumbai. You can see them in Kerala. So coral reefs are really everywhere, but they are not, as substantially studied compared to other places. And most of research in India also happens in places like Lakshadweep and the Andamans and the Gulf of Kutch and Mannar. And just from those areas, since 1998, there has been severe bleaching. I'm a little more familiar with the Andamans, where there was a huge, very severe bleaching event in 2010, and there are surveys that showed that at least 50% of all coral was lost just in 2010. And so what you are seeing right now in many locations in the Andamans really are a recovering reef. Can coral be grown and cultivated in a laboratory or in simulated conditions? Yes, they can. There are actually people, they can be grown in a lab. In fact, there are in many countries, corals are animals that people like to grow in captivity, sort of like pets. But it's very tricky. They're not easy to grow, and they need very specific conditions, and there are very different, depending on which species. Some of them are easier and some of them are harder, but their survival rate in general is quite low. So it's usually from a restoration or conservation point of view, you'd want to be doing transplantation and restoration sort of as your last resort. You wouldn't want to think about doing restoration so that you can do something else in that area, only because the survival rate is quite low, mortality is extremely high. What can we do as individuals starting today to help conserve the ocean and environment in general? So that's quite a, I mean, I can always think of so many things. So to try and make a coherent point, I would say two things that I can think of would be, one is to reduce how much of disposable plastic that you use. Because obviously everything that we use is made of plastic, the planes we fly, the cars, the phones, but things that you will use and throw, to try and reduce the amount of plastic we use there. In general, the overall, everything that we consume ultimately is resulting in greenhouse emissions, whether it's the textile industry or a lot of the food that we use. So in general, trying to sort of moderate that. And definitely plastic is huge in that sense, and trying to reduce your sort of plastic consumption can go a long way. And second, if you do eat seafood, for instance, trying to find ways in which you can opt for types of seafood that are either not caught using really destructive practices like trawling, or eating seafood that is, in season. So, seafood that has not been caught during the time that they're breeding, or eating species that are still very small, that haven't, grown large enough to reproduce. And so you might probably be wondering, where are you going to get all that information? How are you going to do that research? But to date, in India, you have two sort of programs that you can subscribe to give you these answers. So one is called Know Your Fish, and the other one is called In Season Fish. So these are two things that you can find online, find them on social media, and they will give you monthly recommendations of seafood that you should avoid, and seafood that you can opt for instead, and not have significant impact on the marine life. Could you please let me know how children can learn more and contribute to marine conservation? So I would suggest that whenever it is possible, try to get to the nearest space where you can actually see the ocean. So whether it's snorkeling or diving, or even going in the intertidal, where you can wade through a couple of inches of water and see these animals there. And today there are a lot of programs that you can do online, which can teach you about marine life. For instance, that is one of the things that I do. And those are small steps in which you can actually sort of increase awareness and knowledge about these ecosystems. Are there any internship opportunities available so as to have hands-on experience on coral restoration or genetically modifying them? So there are loads of internship opportunities that you can find around the world. A lot of restoration. So restoration projects are constantly ongoing, right? These are long-term projects that you want to be seeing go on for at least a couple of decades. So in different parts of the world, these go on, and they do need people to help to constantly maintain, check on these corals, keep them clean, monitor their progress. And a lot of these are actually volunteer based. Or you can sign up for them. Maybe your minimum requirement would be to be a certified diver. In India, there are quite a few organizations that you could contact to intern with, like Reef Watch Marine Conservation, which is not just based in the Andamans, but also along mainland India. There's Dakshin Foundation, there is Nature Conservation Foundation, and there are many others that I can maybe try and collate a list and give you. You can just drop me an email. You can contact me through our website, spidersinthesea.com. Has there been any type of coral that have gone extinct? I actually do not know if which species have gone extinct, but there have been a lot of cases of local extinction. So areas where the entire region has sort of become a dead zone because of bleaching over time. So areas that no longer have coral, but I am not sure if there's been any species that has gone extinct completely, off Earth. So that's actually something that I will find out.
We have time for two more questions, Chetna.
Oh.
There's one about jewelry.
Jewelry, yes.
Yeah, actually, there are a couple of them. So what about coral and jewelry? Is this also contributing to the extension of species? Actually, yes, because coral extraction, so corals right now, it is illegal to extract or remove corals. And even today, if you find, say, a broken dead bit of coral on the beach, which will look like a honeycomb structure, even though it's dead, being in possession of coral is illegal. You can be fined or you can go to jail. That's because there was heavy extraction of corals for ornaments over the past few decades. It still continues to go on. So it is illegal, and it has caused a huge dent in some species like the fan corals or the gorgonians. How do coral colonies communicate with each other so as to spawn at the same time? So that is actually a brilliant question. So yes, they have to spawn at the same time to be able to synchronize, so their spawning event doesn't go to waste. One thing we know is that there are certain times of the year that they will spawn at the same time. And usually this is somewhat closer to the summer. And this usually happens when there is a full moon and a certain time of the tide, and closer to, and it starts off at dusk closer to midnight. So that way they synchronize. And usually sometimes it's only one species, but sometimes a bunch of different species will spawn at the same time to sort of make use of that large scale event. Okay, so I guess that's my two questions.
There are several interesting questions, I have to say. I'm sorry we are running out of time, but maybe we can email it to you, email answers to you, and
Yeah.
send Chetna the other questions. Thank you, Chetna, for this fascinating session and for taking us on this incredible journey of your life's work and this whole other world that we are obviously so oblivious to. And thank you for showing us those absolutely stunning images. I'm sure many of us have have a newfound interest and an itch to go underwater and visit our coral neighbors as soon as it's physically possible, that is. We'd like to extend a special thanks to Veena Kapoor and Shweta Taneja and everyone at NCF for their wonderful work and for putting us in touch with Chetna and for making this session happen. Thank you, audience, for joining us, and see you all next time.
All right. Thank you so much. See you all.
Thank you. Bye.